The boy who would one day be called great was born in the rugged kingdom of Macedon, a land of high mountains and hard riders, where loyalty was sworn with wine and steel. His name was Alexander, son of Philip II of Macedon. Philip transformed a rough northern realm into the dominant military power of the Greek world. From childhood, Alexander was surrounded by ambition. His father drilled into him the idea that destiny was not inherited, was seized. As a youth, Alexander was entrusted to the philosopher Aristotle. Under his guidance, he studied poetry, science, medicine, and philosophy. He read Homer obsessively, keeping a copy of the Iliad beneath his pillow, imagining himself as Achilles reborn. Yet education did not soften him. He tamed the wild horse Bucephalus when seasoned men could not, proving both courage and keen perception. He saw that the animal feared its own shadow, turned it toward the sun, and mounted it. The lesson was clear. Where others saw chaos, Alexander saw opportunity. When Philip was assassinated, the 20-year-old prince ascended the throne amid conspiracy and revolt. Greek city-states murmured rebellion, sensing weakness in youth. Alexander responded with breathtaking speed. He marched south, crushed resistance, and razed Thebes as a warning, sparing only temples and the house of the poet Pindar. The message echoed across the peninsula of Greece. The son was as formidable as the father, but his vision stretched beyond internal control. Philip had long planned an invasion of the Persian Empire, and Alexander adopted that ambition as his own. In 334 BCE, he crossed the Hellespont with a relatively small but highly disciplined army. Before him lay the immense territories of Persia, ruled by Darius III. The campaign began at the Granicus River, where Persian satraps gathered their forces. Against advice, Alexander charged directly into the river and up the opposite bank under heavy attack. The clash was brutal. Spears splintered, men drowned, horses screamed. Yet the Macedonian phalanx held firm, and the companion cavalry smashed through enemy lines. Victory opened Asia Minor to him. Cities fell one by one. Some surrendered willingly, others resisted and suffered. Alexander adopted a policy both ruthless and strategic. He would punish defiance, but reward submission. He portrayed himself not as a destroyer, but as a liberator from Persian rule. Greek cities welcomed him. Others trembled. The decisive confrontation came at the narrow coastal plain near the town of Issus there. At the Battle of Issus, Alexander faced Darius in person. The Persian king commanded a vast army, but geography constricted his numerical advantage. Alexander struck toward the center, aiming directly for Darius. The sight of the Macedonian king leading the charge unsettled the Persian line. When Darius fled in his chariot, panic spread like fire through dry grass. The Persian camp and the king's own family fell into Alexander's hands. Yet instead of cruelty, he showed calculated magnanimity, treating Darius's mother and wife with respect. This was no mere courtesy, it was propaganda. Alexander intended not only to defeat Persia, but to inherit it. After Issus, he marched south along the Mediterranean coast, besieging the island fortress of Tyre in one of antiquity's most remarkable military feats. When the city finally fell after months of resistance, he demonstrated the terrible cost of defiance. From there, he continued to Egypt, where he was welcomed as a liberator from Persian dominance. In the fertile valley of the Nile, he founded a city bearing his name, envisioning it as a beacon of trade and culture. In the deserts beyond, he journeyed to the oracle at the Siwa oasis. What the priests told him remains uncertain. But afterward, Alexander embraced the notion that he was more than mortal, perhaps even the son of a god. Whether belief or political theater, this conviction deepened his aura among followers and subjects alike. By the time he left Egypt, he was no longer merely a Macedonian king. He was a claimant to the throne of Asia, marching eastward toward the heart of the Persian Empire. His soldiers followed him through heat, hunger, and endless miles, bound by loyalty, plunder, and the magnetic force of his personality. Ahead lay the plains where empires would be decided. The confrontation that would decide the fate of Persia unfolded near the village of Gaugamela. On that wide plain, carefully chosen by Darius for its open terrain, The armies assembled in 331 BCE at the Battle of Gaugamela. Darius had scythed chariots, cavalry from across his vast dominions, and numbers that dwarfed the Macedonian force. Alexander studied the field with a tactician's eye. He knew a frontal assault would be disastrous. Instead, he advanced at an angle, stretching the Persian line. Darius was forced to extend his own troops to avoid being outflanked. Gaps formed. In a moment of calculated daring, Alexander led the companion cavalry in a wedge formation straight toward the weakened center, once again aiming for Darius himself. The clash was thunderous. Chariots were neutralized by disciplined infantry, who opened lanes and struck the horses as they passed. Dust choked the air. Amid the chaos, Alexander's charge broke through. As before, Darius lost his nerve and fled. With the king's departure, resistance collapsed. The Persian Empire, centuries old, effectively died on that field. Alexander pressed onward, entering the great capitals of Babylon, Susa, and finally Persepolis. In Persepolis, the ceremonial heart of Persia, he allowed his troops to loot the treasury. Later, in a moment still debated by historians, the palace complex was set ablaze, whether drunken impulse or symbolic vengeance for earlier Persian invasions of Greece. The flames marked the end of an era. But conquest did not bring rest. Darius was eventually murdered by his own satraps while fleeing east. When Alexander found his rival's body, he covered it with his cloak and sent it for royal burial. He now claimed the title of King of Asia. Yet ruling such a vast realm required more than victory. Alexander began adopting Persian dress and customs, integrating Persian nobles into his administration, and encouraging marriages between his officers and local women. Many Macedonians resented this shift, seeing it as betrayal of their traditions. Conspiracies brewed. Still, Alexander pushed onward, chasing rebels into the mountains of Central Asia. He crossed the towering passes of the Hindu Kush, enduring freezing conditions and fierce resistance. In these remote regions, he founded more cities, spreading Greek language and culture deep into Asia. The campaign had transformed into something larger than revenge. It was a fusion of worlds. But ambition knows no natural boundary. Beyond lay India, a land of wealth and mystery. Reports spoke of powerful kings and war elephants. Alexander, driven by insatiable curiosity and a desire to reach the ends of the world, prepared his army for yet another campaign. The Macedonian soldiers, hardened veterans who had marched thousands of miles, followed once more. They had crossed deserts and mountains, shattered empires, and seen their king crowned pharaoh and great king. Yet ahead awaited a test unlike any before. Months, soon rains, vast rivers, and unfamiliar foes. The edge of their endurance was near, though they did not yet know it. For Alexander, every horizon concealed another to surpass. In 326 BCE, Alexander reached the banks of the Indus River. The campaign in India began with alliances and swift victories, but resistance stiffened as he advanced. The most formidable opponent was King Porus, who commanded a formidable force bolstered by war elephants. Their armies met at the Battle of the Hydaspes, near the Hydaspes River. Monsoon rains lashed the earth, turning ground to mud. Alexander executed a daring night crossing upstream, deceiving Porus about his true position. When battle commenced, the elephants charged, terrifying horses unused to their scent and sound. The clash was savage and chaotic, yet discipline and adaptability prevailed. Macedonian troops targeted the elephants' drivers and hamstrung the beasts. Cavalry maneuvers encircled Indian forces. Porus fought bravely until wounded and captured. When brought before Alexander and asked how he wished to be treated, Porus replied, "Like a king." Impressed, Alexander reinstated him as a subordinate ruler, expanding his territory rather than diminishing it. Despite victory, morale within the Macedonian ranks collapsed. At the Hydaspes River, they refused to march farther east, exhausted, longing for home, and fearful of rumored armies beyond. They mutinied in quiet defiance. For the first time, Alexander faced an enemy he could not outmaneuver his own men's will. After days of brooding, he relented. The march eastward ended. Instead, they turned south, sailing down the Indus and fighting fierce tribes along the way. During one assault, Alexander was severely wounded by an arrow that pierced his lung. For a moment, the empire teetered on the edge of losing its architect. Recovering, he led part of his forces through the brutal Gedrosian desert, a march that cost thousands of lives. It was a grim reminder that nature could be as deadly as any army. Returning west, Alexander sought to consolidate his empire. He organized mass weddings between his officers and Persian women, attempting to bind cultures together. Among his closest companions was Hephaestion, whose death in 324 BCE devastated him. The loss revealed a more vulnerable side of the conqueror. Beneath armor and legend was a grieving friend. In 323 BCE, in Babylon, Alexander fell ill after a banquet. Fever consumed him over days. Rumors swirled poison, infection, exhaustion. As his generals gathered, they asked to whom he left his empire. According to tradition, he whispered, "To the strongest." At just 32 years old, he died in Babylon, leaving behind an empire that stretched from Greece to India. Without a clear heir, his generals carved the realm into rival kingdoms. The unity he forged dissolved into conflict, yet his impact endured. Greek culture spread across Asia in a blending known as the Hellenistic Age. Cities he founded became centers of trade and learning. Legends of his exploits traveled far beyond the boundaries of his empire, transforming him into myth. Alexander's conquest was not merely a sequence of battles. It was the violent birth of a new interconnected world. In little more than a decade, he shattered an ancient superpower, marched to the fringes of the known earth, and altered the course of history. His life burned intensely and briefly, like a comet, across the ancient sky, brilliant, unstoppable, and gone too soon. When news of Alexander the Great's death spread, shock rippled from the Mediterranean to India. In Babylon, his generals gathered around a silent throne. The empire had no clear adult heir. His half-brother, Aristides, was impaired. His wife Roxana carried an unborn child. Ambition stepped into that vacuum. The men who had ridden beside Alexander now eyed one another with suspicion. These were the Diadochi, the successors. Formidable figures such as Ptolemy I Soter, Seleucus I Nicator, and Antigonus I Monophthalmus. Each had commanded armies, governed provinces, and dreamed of glory. Now they would test their strength. Initially, they attempted unity. The empire was divided into satrapies, with Aristides proclaimed King Philip III, and the infant Alexander IV recognized as ruler. But this fragile arrangement could not contain rivalries. Within months, alliances shifted and accusations flew. Perdiccas, regent, sought to maintain central authority. Others resisted. Civil war erupted. In Egypt, Ptolemy secured control, even seizing Alexander's embalmed body and bringing it to Alexandria, the gleaming city Alexander had founded. Possessing the conqueror's remains was more than symbolic, it was a claim to legitimacy. Meanwhile, Antigonus consolidated power in Asia Minor, while Seleucus maneuvered carefully in Babylon. The wars of the successors were brutal and protracted. Battles that once united Macedonians against Persia now pitted them against one another. Fortunes rose and fell with astonishing speed. Antigonus came closest to reuniting the empire, proclaiming himself king. Yet, at the climactic Battle of Ipsus, a coalition of rivals shattered his ambitions. War elephant echoes of the Indian campaigns blocked his cavalry, and he fell on the field at nearly 80 years old. By the early 3rd century BCE, Alexander's empire had fractured into major Hellenistic kingdoms. Ptolemy ruled Egypt, establishing the Ptolemaic dynasty. Seleucus commanded vast eastern territories, forming the Seleucid Empire. In Macedonia and Greece, the Antigonid dynasty eventually prevailed. The unity of conquest had dissolved, but something enduring remained, a shared cultural transformation. Greek language became the lingua franca, from the Mediterranean to Central Asia. Cities founded or refounded by Alexander served as hubs of commerce and learning. In Egypt, the Library of Alexandria gathered scholars from across the known world. Trade routes expanded, blending ideas, art, and technology. This period, known as the Hellenistic Age, was Alexander's unintended legacy. In lands once ruled by Persian kings, Greek theaters rose beside ancient temples. Philosophers debated in marketplaces where Eastern spices and Western olive oil were traded. Soldiers settled in distant provinces, marrying local women and raising children who embodied two worlds. Yet the spirit of conquest that defined Alexander did not vanish. His legend grew with each retelling. Stories embellished his deeds, transforming him into a near-mythical hero. In Egypt, some regarded him as divine. In Persia, tales adapted him into their own tradition. Across centuries, he became a figure claimed by many cultures. Back in Macedonia, time marched forward. Rome, once a minor power in Italy, began expanding eastward. In the 2nd century BCE, Roman legions confronted the descendants of Alexander's generals. At the Battle of Pydna, the Roman Manipula legion defeated the Macedonian phalanx, signaling the end of Antigonid rule. Greece fell under Roman control soon after. The Seleucid Empire weakened under internal strife and external pressure. Eastern provinces broke away, forming new realms. In Egypt, the Ptolemaic dynasty endured longer, but it too would succumb. The famous Queen Cleopatra VII, a descendant of Ptolemy, struggled to preserve independence through alliances with Roman leaders. Her defeat marked the final absorption of Alexander's successor states into the Roman world. And yet, even Rome felt Alexander's shadow. Roman generals admired him. Some sought to emulate him. Julius Caesar is said to have wept in Spain, lamenting that at his age Alexander had conquered the world, while he had achieved little. The conqueror became a benchmark for ambition itself. Centuries later, medieval romances reimagined him as a wandering hero exploring fantastical realms. In Persian literature, he appeared in epic poetry. In Islamic tradition, some associated him with figures in sacred texts. His image crossed boundaries of language, religion, and geography. But beyond legend lay tangible change. The fusion of Greek and Eastern cultures reshaped art, science, and governance. Astronomy advanced as scholars combined Babylonian records with Greek mathematics. Sculpture captured human emotion with new realism. Philosophical schools such as Stoicism and Epicureanism emerged. In this interconnected world, the seeds of globalization, in a sense, were planted by Alexander's campaigns. Trade routes, linking the Mediterranean to India and beyond, flourished. Ideas traveled alongside goods. Concepts of kingship, religion, architecture. Even after political unity fractured, cultural exchange endured. Yet historians continue to debate his character. Was he a visionary unifier or a ruthless conqueror? He destroyed cities, executed rivals, and demanded divine honors. He also encouraged cultural blending and respected local customs. He could be magnanimous to a defeated king like Paris, yet merciless to rebellious populations. His army's loyalty was forged in shared hardship. They marched thousands of miles, fought countless battles, and endured extremes of climate. Their mutiny at the Hydaspes River revealed both their devotion and their limits. Even the greatest leader must heed the human cost of ambition. In examining Alexander's conquest, one sees more than victories. One sees the collision of civilizations, the fragility of empire, and the enduring power of cultural exchange. The world he left behind was irrevocably altered, not unified under one ruler, but interconnected in ways previously unimaginable. The young king from Macedon had set out to avenge Persian invasions and secure Greek dominance. Instead, he dismantled an ancient empire and forged a new era. Though his life lasted only 32 years, its impact echoed for millennia. His tomb's exact location remains uncertain, a mystery that mirrors the enigma of his legacy. Yet his name endures in cities, histories, and legends. From the mountains of Greece to the deserts of Egypt and the rivers of India, the imprint of his march can still be traced. Alexander's conquest was not merely about land seized or battles won. It was about the transformation of the ancient world, a dramatic reshaping of power, culture, and imagination. Empires rose and fell in his wake, but the world that emerged carried his mark. Long after the sound of marching phalanxes faded into history, long after the wars of the successors had carved up his dominions, the legend of Alexander the Great continued to grow. His conquests reshaped the political map, but it was the cultural, intellectual, and psychological aftershock that truly transformed the ancient world. In Egypt, under Ptolemy I Soter, Alexandria blossomed into one of the greatest centers of learning in antiquity. The famous library and Malseon attracted mathematicians, astronomers, poets, and physicians from across the Mediterranean and Near East. Greek became the language of scholarship, administration, and trade, stretching from the Aegean Sea to the borders of India. This linguistic unity, born from conquest, allowed ideas to travel faster and farther than ever before. In the Eastern territories, Greek cities stood alongside ancient Mesopotamian and Persian settlements. Markets buzzed with merchants speaking multiple tongues. Soldiers who marched with Alexander settled in distant provinces, marrying local women and raising families that embodied both Greek and Eastern traditions. Religious syncretism flourished. Gods were identified across cultures. Zeus blended with local deities, and Eastern symbols entered Greek art. Yet unity was fragile. The Seleucid realm struggled to control its immense territories. In the east, regions like Bactria broke away, forming independent Greek-ruled kingdoms that fused Hellenistic and Indian influences. These frontier states became conduits of exchange between the Mediterranean world and South Asia, spreading artistic motifs, coinage, and ideas. Meanwhile, Macedonia remained a player in the shifting power dynamics. The Antigonid dynasty sought to preserve dominance in Greece. But a new power was rising in the West. The Roman Republic, disciplined and relentless, expanded steadily. Roman leaders studied Alexander's campaigns, admiring his speed and audacity. Some consciously emulated him. In 168 BCE, at the Battle of Pydna, Roman legions decisively defeated the Macedonian phalanx. The once invincible formation that had conquered Persia proved vulnerable to Rome's flexible manipular tactics. Macedonia fell, and Greece soon followed into Rome's sphere. The lands Alexander had unified were now absorbed into a different imperial vision. Even the Ptolemaic kingdom of Egypt, wealthy and resilient, could not withstand Rome forever. Its final dramatic chapter unfolded under Cleopatra VII, who sought alliances with powerful Romans to maintain independence. When Egypt fell to Rome, the political structures born of Alexander's conquests had vanished, but the cultural synthesis endured. Across centuries, Alexander's name evolved into myth. In the Middle East, he appeared in Persian epics as a heroic ruler. In medieval Europe, romances depicted him exploring the depths of the sea and ascending toward the heavens. In parts of Asia, local traditions adapted him into their own histories, sometimes portraying him as a just king, other times as a world conqueror. Historians have long debated the meaning of his conquest. Militarily, his achievements were staggering. In just over a decade, he dismantled the Achaemenid Persian Empire, one of the largest and most sophisticated states of the ancient world. His victories at Issus and Gaugamela demonstrated tactical brilliance, while the grueling Battle of the Hydaspes revealed adaptability. But conquest came at immense cost. Cities were destroyed, populations displaced, and countless soldiers perished in distant lands. The march through deserts and mountains tested human endurance to its limits. The Gedrosian desert crossing alone claimed thousands of lives. Even Alexander himself bore scars from numerous wounds, including the near-fatal injury in India. What drove him? Ambition, certainly, a desire for glory shaped by Homeric ideals. Perhaps a genuine curiosity about lands beyond the horizon. His adoption of Persian customs suggests he envisioned a blended ruling class, not merely Macedonian dominance. Leadership defined him. He fought at the front lines, inspiring fierce loyalty. He rewarded bravery lavishly. Yet he could also be impulsive and harsh. In moments of anger, he executed trusted companions. As his empire expanded, so did the tension between his Macedonian roots and his increasingly cosmopolitan identity. His death in 323 BCE in Babylon remains shrouded in mystery. Illness is the most accepted explanation, though rumors of poisoning persisted. Without his commanding presence, the empire fractured quickly. It became clear that the cohesion of his realm had depended on his personal authority. And yet, perhaps fragmentation was inevitable. The distances were vast, communication slow, and cultural differences profound. What survived was not political unity, but cultural transformation. The Hellenistic world that emerged after Alexander was dynamic and interconnected. Scientific inquiry flourished. Advances in geometry, astronomy, and medicine built upon earlier traditions. Trade networks extended farther east. Urban planning reflected Greek models, with grid systems and public spaces encouraging civic life. Alexander's conquest marked the end of the classical Greek city-state era and the beginning of a more cosmopolitan age. Individuals could travel across continents and still find familiar language and institutions. The ancient world became, in a sense, smaller. Today, the figure of Alexander endures as one of history's most studied and controversial leaders. Some see him as a brilliant strategist whose vision fostered cross-cultural exchange. Others view him as a destructive imperialist. What is undeniable is scale. No ruler before him had pushed the boundaries of the known world so dramatically in so short a time. From the mountains of Macedon to the rivers of India, his march redrew maps and redefined possibility. In the end, Alexander's conquest was a paradox. It shattered empires, yet seeded cultural unity. It brought devastation, yet fostered exchange. It depended on one man's extraordinary will, yet its consequences unfolded far beyond his lifetime. Empires fade, cities crumble, and battlefields return to silence. But the ripple effects of certain lives continue across millennia. Alexander's was one such life, a brief, blazing force that altered the trajectory of the ancient world and left a legacy still debated, admired, and questioned to this day.